My father abandoned my mother on a trip and forbade me from going to her house after I gave away my concert ticket because he didn't want to attend. But now my father won't be able to walk away from the divorce. Before you give me your opinion, I need to give you some context about my relationship with my father and how we got to this point. It might be a bit of a long story, but I want to be as clear as possible because I need to know if I'm the one in the wrong, or if things between my father and I are just doomed to be like this. I grew up in a middle-class family in a small town. Since I was little, I was always the odd one in the family, according to my father. My passion for music started when I was 7 or 8 years old. My mother signed me up for piano lessons because I kept insisting that I wanted to learn. My earliest memories of playing music are pure happiness. It was as if I had finally found something that made me feel at home. My father, on the other hand, never understood. My younger sister was born when I was 10, and from then on, my relationship with my father began to change. At first, I thought it was simply because he now had to split his attention between 2 children, which made sense. I kept on with my music, not stopping for a second, and my mother supported me in everything. As the years went by, my father started to focus much more on my sister. Don't get me wrong, I've always loved my sister, and our relationship has been like that of any siblings, with some rivalry here and there, but generally good. However, I couldn't help but notice how my father clearly favored her. Everyone in the house noticed it, even my mother, although she never said it out loud. I suppose, in part, she didn't want to create more conflict where there was already tension. By the time I reached high school, I had made up my mind. I was going to dedicate my life to music. I knew it would be hard, that it wasn't a safe or traditional career, as my father put it, but it was what I loved. I would lock myself in my room for hours to practice, and that's when I started dreaming about studying at Juilliard, the prestigious conservatory. The application process was brutal. I practiced non-stop, and though I didn't expect it, I was eventually accepted. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. My mother cried with joy. My sister was also excited. My father, however, barely reacted. "Juilliard," he said with a raised eyebrow and a disapproving look. "I don't see what kind of future that holds. You should have applied for something more serious, something that will give you stability." It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but at that moment, it hurt more because, for me, I had achieved something incredible, and he just couldn't understand it. My mother tried to soften things, saying she was proud of me, and that helped a bit. But my father's comment left a thorn in my side that I couldn't get rid of. And so, I began to drift away from him. My relationship with my father deteriorated even further when I started my studies in New York. The day I left, which should have been one of the most important moments of my life, he didn't even show up to say goodbye. My mother and sister took me to the airport, but he made an excuse, saying he had to work. I knew it was a lie. He just didn't want to be there. He didn't approve of my choice, and he was punishing me in the only way he knew: indifference. Over the next few years, I came home a few times, mostly to visit my mother and sister. My father remained distant, and every time he spoke to me, he found a way to belittle what I was doing. Once, during a family dinner, I mentioned that I was working on a new composition for an orchestra I was part of. His response was, "Well, I guess that's better than playing on the street for coins." He said it jokingly, but everyone at the table could feel the awkwardness in the air. My mother tried to change the subject, but I just bit my tongue and continued eating in silence. I knew confronting him would do no good. The worst part was that he wasn't even paying for my education. I got a partial scholarship, and I covered the rest with student loans, help from my mother, and a part-time job in New York. My mother helped me with what she could, but my father didn't contribute a cent. To him, it just wasn't worth investing in something like that. Eventually, I achieved what I had been waiting for: my first professional concert. I was excited, not only because it was a big step in my career, but also because I thought that maybe, just maybe, my father would finally see what I had accomplished and change his mind. I bought tickets for my mother, my sister, and despite everything, for my father too. I traveled home a few weeks before the concert to share the good news with them during a family dinner. My mother and sister were excited, talking about how amazing it would be to go to New York, stay at my apartment, and see me perform. My father, however, made a comment that left me cold. "Well, I already have other plans that day, so we won't be able to go." He said it as if he was deciding for everyone in the house, not just himself. At first, I thought he was joking. Who rejects an opportunity like that? It was a concert in New York, I was offering free accommodation, and they wouldn't have to pay for anything but the trip. But no, he wasn't joking. He looked at me with the same uninterested expression he had worn for years. That's when it hit me. My father would never accept what I had chosen to do with my life. No matter what I achieved, I would always be a disappointment to him. That was my breaking point. I returned to New York and gave away my father's ticket to a friend in the orchestra who wanted to bring someone else. I didn't see the point in holding onto it for someone who wouldn't appreciate it. Now, this is where my problem starts. Last week, right before the concert, my mother and sister were packing for the trip to New York when my father suddenly asked where they were going. My mother calmly reminded him that they had already discussed this. They were going to the concert. And that's when the strangest thing happened. My father said he wanted to go, too. Out of nowhere, the same father who didn't care at all about my profession now wanted to see me perform. Anyway, they made the trip together, and when I met them at the station in New York, I was surprised to see my father there. I didn't have a ticket for him, obviously, but I figured he had just taken advantage of the free trip to spend the weekend in the city. That night, we all went to dinner, and to my surprise, he said he was excited to see my concert. I couldn't help but ask what had changed, because, as far as I knew, he hadn't been interested in coming. He told me he hadn't understood what it was about. He thought it was going to be a rock concert in a bar, and now that he knew it was a more important event, he was eager to see it. He even started asking about the kind of people who would be attending and whether any famous people would be there. That's when I got angry. I told him I didn't have a ticket for him anymore, that I had given it away. His face immediately changed, and he started yelling at me in the middle of the restaurant, accusing me of making him travel all that way just to mock him. He said I was playing with him, and that I was a selfish son who only cared about myself and my music. At that moment, I couldn't take it anymore. I told him that he had rejected the ticket when I first offered it, and that he was only here now because he thought he could get something out of it for his own benefit. I told him a father should support his child, no matter what they do, and that his disdain just showed how little he really cared. If the concert had been in a bar, he should have supported me just the same, because that's what a father does. After that, my father got up and left the restaurant. My mother, sister, and I sat in silence, finished dinner as best we could, and went back to the apartment. The concert was the next day, and everything went perfectly. But when we returned to the apartment, my father was already packing to leave. It was late at night, and my mother tried to convince him to wait until morning, but he wouldn't listen. That was last night, and I've already bought my mother and sister return tickets since my father left without even worrying about them. So, Reddit, am I the bad guy for selling my father's ticket? Should I have done something differently? Update 1. Thank you to everyone who responded to my previous post. Honestly, I didn't expect so many replies. Most of you agreed that I wasn't the bad guy in this situation, and that has given me a bit of peace of mind. I think I needed to hear that from people who aren't directly involved in my life. A lot of you pointed out the obvious. My father wasn't interested in my concert or in what I had achieved. He simply saw an opportunity when he thought the event could be important, with influential people he might meet or impress. His interest wasn't in me, but in what he could get from the situation. And when he realized he no longer had a spot at the concert, he behaved like a child who had his favorite toy taken away. That tantrum in the restaurant made it clear that what really hurt him was losing what he thought would be an opportunity for his own benefit. The irony is that there really weren't any important people at the concert, at least not the type my father was expecting. Sure, there were a few relevant names in the classical music industry, but it wasn't like it was an event full of celebrities he could meet or network with. So, in a way, he didn't miss much, at least from his selfish perspective. Still, I know he's deeply angry with me, not just for giving away his ticket, but because his plan fell apart spectacularly, and he has no one to blame but himself, though I'm sure he doesn't see it that way. My mother and sister returned yesterday afternoon. After the concert, they had decided to spend one more day in New York. They took their time exploring the city since they were already there and weren't in any rush to go back. The idea was to relax a bit after the stress caused by my father's behavior. When they finally took the train back, they arrived home nearly at night, which, apparently, was a bigger problem than they had expected. It turns out my father had been waiting for them much earlier. According to what my mom told me, he was convinced they would take the first train in the morning, right after leaving him to return home alone. I guess in his mind, since he had left in the middle of the night, everyone else should have followed his example and returned immediately. But they didn't. They chose to spend time with me, their son and brother, and he just couldn't handle it. When they arrived, my mother and father had a big argument. My father was furious, but not just because they had spent more time in New York. According to my mom, he told her he had expected them to understand that after his grand gesture of traveling for the concert, even though he didn't attend in the end, the least they could do was come back early to be with him. As if his tantrum the night before wasn't enough. He seemed unable to accept that my mom and sister didn't revolve around him, especially after his dramatic exit from the city. My mother, as always, stayed calm but didn't let herself be intimidated. She told him they didn't come back late to annoy him, but because they were with me, spending time together as a family, something he didn't want to do. You didn't travel alone because we wanted you to, she told him. You traveled alone because you left, angry over something that was entirely your fault. Of course, my father didn't stay quiet for long. According to my mom, he quickly went from disappointment to full-blown rage. He started talking about me, as if I were the root of all the problems. He even went as far as to demand that she cut ties with me, saying it was time to stop spoiling me and that they should disinherit me. I swear, when my mom told me this, I thought it was a joke. Apparently, his reasoning is that I've been a bad son, that I haven't respected his authority, and I haven't made the life choices he expected of me. All of this is ridiculous, especially since he hasn't contributed anything to my life, neither professionally nor financially, since I left home. My mother told me that she responded as clearly as possible that she wasn't going to do any of that. She made it very clear that if he has a problem with me, that's his problem, not hers. She's not going to cut off her own son just because my father can't handle his emotions or accept that I've chosen a different path in life. For her, it's clear that what my father really needs is to confront his own frustrations instead of trying to impose his desires on everyone else. The argument ended with my father sleeping on the couch that night. I'm not sure if this is a sign of something bigger going on between them, but it's hard to ignore that his attitude is affecting the peace at home. My mom hasn't told me much more since then, but I'm worried about how this might escalate. I don't want to be the cause of conflicts between them, even though I know my mother doesn't blame me for what's happening, and it's not my fault that my father is like this. I still don't want to be the source of their problems. For now, I can only wait and see how things develop. My mother and sister are fine, and that's what matters most to me. Anyway, I just wanted to share this update with you. I don't know how all of this will be resolved, but I truly appreciate your comments and advice. Update 2. Today was one of those days that starts out like any other, but ends up being a bit strange. This morning, as I was having breakfast and getting ready for work, I got a call from my father. If you thought it was a call to apologize or try to mend things between us, I'm sorry to disappoint you. It was quite the opposite. When I saw his name on the screen, I naively thought that maybe he had realized how ridiculous everything had been and wanted to take a step toward reconciliation. But from his first hello, I could tell that he wasn't in a good mood. And as the conversation went on, I found out exactly why. There was something in his tone that made me feel this wasn't going to end well, and unfortunately, I was right. After the usual greetings, the lecture began. According to him, everything happening in our family, his ridiculous fight with my mom, the fact that he's sleeping on the couch, is all my fault. Yes, you read that right. I'm the reason he's sleeping on the couch, that his back hurts, that he's not sleeping well, and that things at home aren't going smoothly. At first, I was so stunned by his audacity that I didn't know whether to laugh or get angry, but as the conversation went on, I realized there was nothing funny about it. My father continued with what seemed like a rehearsed script. He called me ungrateful, spoiled, and obsessed with music to the exclusion of everything else. He repeated several times that, because of me, my mom had forced him to sleep on the couch and that he wouldn't return to bed until things were fixed between us, meaning, until I apologized. In other words, until I apologized for being, in his eyes, an ungrateful son. And the worst part is, despite everything that's happened, he made it very clear he wasn't going to apologize for anything. Hearing that, I couldn't hold back anymore. I told him there was absolutely nothing for me to apologize for. For years, I've tried to improve our relationship, but every time I make an effort, he just finds a way to make things worse. I told him that if he wanted to find someone to blame for everything happening, maybe he should start by looking in the mirror, because that's where all the answers were. He didn't take my comment well at all. He told me to stop being sarcastic, to which I responded that it wasn't sarcasm. I told him that this was the truth, though he probably didn't like it because deep down, he knew it was real. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, but I knew it wasn't because he was reflecting. I could tell he was holding himself back from blowing up again. After that uncomfortable pause, he switched tactics. He told me that I better fix things with my mom, because if I didn't, he would disinherit me. And that's when the conversation took an even more absurd turn. First, I told him I didn't need his money. I explained that I'm working in a field I love, that I'm able to support myself, and that I've been doing so since I left home. Although, to be honest, I didn't tell the full truth in that moment. My mom has helped me as much as she could since I left home and has always been there to support me. But at that moment, I just said the first thing that came to mind. My father, of course, didn't stay quiet. He hit me with one of those responses I was expecting, something like, maybe you're forgetting all the years you lived under my roof before you left. According to him, I should at least show some respect for having been given a home. That was the final straw. I told him that I had already shown him plenty of respect, more than he probably deserved. Over all these years, I've put up with his derogatory comments, his constant disapproval, and his disdain for my career and my choices. All of that more than repays any debt I had for living under his roof, though technically, that roof is also my mom's, and to be honest, she's the only one of the two who has truly supported me. Then, as usual, he tried to twist the situation to make me feel guilty again. And he threw out the ultimate threat. If I didn't take responsibility for everything, I'd better not show my face around the house. It was one of those statements meant to sound like the final word, the ultimate decision of a man who thinks he's in control. But, to be honest, I was fed up with the conversation and was running late for work. So, before he could continue his monologue, I said something I probably shouldn't have, but that felt like the most logical thing at the moment. Don't worry, I'll send you a YouTube tutorial later on how to sleep on the couch, and I hung up the phone. I know it wasn't the best way to end the conversation, and it probably didn't help anything, but I don't think it made things worse than they already were either. Update 3. For those asking about my father and his sleep issues, I have news. He's found a solution. No, he hasn't apologized or worked things out with my mom. Instead, he's temporarily moved into a hotel. That's right, my father has decided that he'd rather pay for a hotel room than sleep on the couch in his own home. In case you're wondering, it's not that my mom kicked him out or anything like that. He chose to leave because, according to him, he's not willing to stay under the same roof if he's not given the respect he believes he deserves. The most ironic part is that, in his mind, the only way to resolve this is if I apologize first. It doesn't matter that he was the one who started all this chaos, or that he's had multiple chances to fix things. For him, the only option is for me to make the first move. And since I'm not planning on doing that, he's decided that staying at a hotel is better than facing the situation at home. Honestly, accepting the YouTube tutorial I was going to send him might have been a more economical solution. As for me, I couldn't care less. In fact, now that he's not at home, I'm considering visiting my mom and sister this weekend. I actually feel more at ease knowing I won't have to deal with his tantrums or arguments during my visit. I'll be able to spend time with him without the constant tension he creates whenever we're all under the same roof. So, that's all for now. Update 4. My plan was simple. Travel to my hometown Friday night, arrive home, spend the weekend, and head back Sunday afternoon. It was a straightforward plan, with no apparent flaws. My father wouldn't know I was planning to visit unless he read Reddit, which wasn't going to happen. I mean, if he wasn't even interested in watching a YouTube tutorial, I highly doubt he'd be on here reading my posts. Unfortunately, as the saying goes, everyone has a plan until. Here's where a famous quote about how plans fall apart would go, but honestly, I don't remember how it goes or who said it. The point is that things didn't turn out as expected. My father found out I was going to be in town, and it wasn't because he started digging through my posts. No, he found out thanks to my sister. I can't blame her. After all, I didn't tell her to keep it a secret, and she's my younger sister. There's no point in getting mad at her over something like that. So there I was, with my seemingly perfect plan, but on Saturday afternoon, my father showed up at the house. The first thing he said when he saw me was something like, "I can't believe you had the nerve to show your face here again." Although I clearly remembered his threat that I shouldn't return home, I also knew this wasn't just his house. It's as much my mother's as it is his, and my visit wasn't to see him, but to spend time with my mother and sister. I wasn't about to stop visiting them just because he decided to throw another tantrum. But before I could respond, my mother stepped in. She told him that it was her house as much as his, and that he had no right to threaten her son like that. She made it clear that I had every right to visit her whenever I wanted, and that if he wasn't willing to fix things, she might as well find her own place and invite whomever she pleased. As expected, my father refused to try to fix anything. He didn't even seem to listen to what my mother was saying. Even my sister, who had been silent the whole time, begged him to stop fighting and just make peace already. But instead of doing that, my father hurled his typical accusations at me again. He claimed that I was turning the family against him, that all I do is poison everyone else, and that to him, I'm no longer part of the family. According to him, I'm just a stranger who has come to destroy his home. After hearing all that, there wasn't much left to say. I took my sister and we went for a walk, mainly to give my parents space to talk without us around, but also because there was no point in staying in the middle of that argument. I'm not sure how long we were gone, but by the time we returned, my father was no longer in the house. That night, we had dinner with my mom in a somewhat tense atmosphere, though we tried to keep the conversation light. I knew my mom wasn't going to talk about what had happened with my dad, and I didn't want to push her to bring it up. It was clear that whatever had happened wasn't good, and she probably didn't want to relive it by talking about it right then. A few days passed after that weekend, and I recently decided to call her to see how she was doing. During the conversation, she eventually told me what had happened that night after we left. Apparently, my father had given her an ultimatum. He was tired of me, tired of the situation, and demanded that she make a choice. Either cut all ties with me, or he would file for divorce. Yes, it was that drastic. He told her he wasn't willing to put up with this situation any longer, and that I wasn't welcome in his life or his home. Of course, my mom didn't accept that pressure. She told him it was unfair to force her to choose between her husband and her son, especially when I hadn't done anything wrong. All I've done is live my life, try to maintain a relationship with my family, and he's the one who's decided that's enough reason to put me on some sort of blacklist. To my mom, it makes no sense, and she's not willing to push me out of her life just because he demands it. Now, I feel bad for my mom. I never wanted things to get to this point, nor did I want her to be forced to choose between her son and her husband. The last thing I want is to be the cause of her problems. But at the same time, I can't say that I'm to blame for all this. What am I supposed to do? Stop visiting my mom just because my dad doesn't like my presence, or because he's decided to hate me? It's a completely ridiculous situation, and I shouldn't have to choose between seeing my mom and making my dad happy, especially when what he wants is so irrational. My mom has reassured me that she won't cut ties with me. She says she's waiting for my dad to come to his senses and realize how irrational he's being about all of this. I'd like to believe that's going to happen, but honestly, I have my doubts. We've been through several situations like this already, and it seems like he just keeps digging deeper into his stubbornness. That's all that's happened lately, and if my father finally apologizes, I'll post another update, although I'm not sure how likely that is. Update 5. It's been 3 months since my last update, and a lot has changed since then. My parents are now in the process of getting a divorce, something that, while not entirely unexpected, is still difficult to come to terms with. First of all, I want to thank everyone who has left positive and supportive messages, both for me and for my mom. It's incredible to see that there are people who understand how complicated and painful this situation is, not just for me, but especially for her. My mom has been through a lot, and knowing that there are people who recognize her strength means a lot to both of us. However, I also want to take this update to address those who have called me the bad guy in this situation, the ones who think I'm somehow responsible for all of this falling apart. I've read comments saying that I provoked this situation, that I somehow planned for my father to get angry to cause the divorce. So let me make this crystal clear. I have tried in every possible way to have a relationship with my father. I've done everything in my power to improve things between us, but he's always been the one to push me away. I didn't decide to destroy our relationship. In fact, he was the one who, at one point, tried to turn my mom against me by demanding that she choose between us. What was I supposed to do in that situation? The reason I went home that weekend wasn't to provoke his anger or to make my parents divorce. I simply wanted to see my mom and my sister, knowing that while he was still in the house, it would be impossible to spend time with them without everything blowing up. And what happened afterward just proves I was right. Should I have stayed away from my own family entirely just because he couldn't stand my presence? It's easy for those criticizing me to say I'm the bad guy, but if I had distanced myself from my mom and sister, those same people would now be saying I'm the bad guy for punishing my mom when she isn't to blame for the problems with my dad. So, what was I supposed to do? It seems that for some, my father can do no wrong. It's as if he's just a victim of all this, with no responsibility in the family breakdown. And without making this any longer, I just want to say that I did the best I could with the hand I was dealt. But it's hard to play well when you've got a father like mine sitting on the other side of the table, with all his demands, his rules, and his complete inability to see beyond his own pride. Anyway, there's no turning back now. My father has decided to go ahead with the divorce, and my mom has no intention of stopping it. I spoke with her recently. She told me that at no point has she felt that I'm to blame for what's happening. If there's one thing she regrets, it's not confronting my father much sooner, before things spiraled out of control. She thinks that maybe, if she had dealt with the situation when I was younger, when I was chasing my dreams, things might have turned out differently. I told her she shouldn't blame herself for anything. My father is who he is, and it's not her responsibility to change him. I've spent much of my life trying to show him he was wrong, trying to prove to him that what I do has value, but he's always been convinced that he's right. And when someone is so completely sure that their perspective is the only correct one, there's nothing in the world that can make them change their mind. It wasn't my mother's fault, and it definitely wasn't mine. My mom has supported me from the beginning, and although I know this is hurting her, I also know she's a strong person. She told me she's ready for whatever comes. And while she didn't want things to end this way, there's no sense in continuing with someone who's so determined to create distance and conflict. Now, it's just a matter of waiting for the legal process of the divorce to move forward. Although emotionally, the divorce happened a long time ago. My father still isn't speaking to me, which isn't a surprise anymore. And honestly, I don't expect that to change. I didn't want things to end this way, but I also can't keep blaming myself for decisions that were never mine. My father chose to step away. My mother chose not to keep putting up with his demands, and I've just been trying to do the best I can with the situation I was given. I'm at peace with that.